In a locked chest in a provincial French town, a sealed letter had been waiting for weeks. The royal officer who held it had been given one instruction: do not break the seal before the night of the 12th of October, 1307. When that night came, he broke it. So did every other officer in France who had received an identical letter, sent out months earlier under the same seal, with the same instruction. What the letters ordered was simple, and the simplicity was the point. At first light on Friday the 13th, in every town where the Knights Templar held property, the doors were to be broken down at once, the men inside arrested, and the gates held until further word arrived from Paris. In Paris itself, the order went to the gates of the Paris Temple, the order's own fortress, the operational center of its wealth, where its Grand Master had been residing as an honored guest of the crown for weeks. Jacques de Molay was inside. He had no warning. He had, until that morning, no reason to expect one. Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. The world the Templars had built was already, by 1307, a world without the purpose that had created it. The order was founded in 1119 by a small company of knights under Jacques de Molay, sworn to protect Christian pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem. Within decades, it had become something far larger, a standing military order bound by monastic vow, exempted by papal bull in 1139 from the authority of local bishops and answerable to Rome alone. Secular kings and lords could still tax the order's lands and dispute its property. The privilege was ecclesiastical, not absolute. But in the eyes of the Church, the temple answered to no one but the Pope. That exemption let the order grow in a way few medieval institutions could. Donations of land poured in across Europe. Its commanderies, fortified estates functioning as agricultural, military, and financial centers at once, multiplied into the thousands. And because the order needed to move money safely across a continent at war with itself, the temple became something closer to a bank than a barracks, holding deposits, issuing letters of credit, financing the wars of kings, including the kings of France. Then, in 1291, the last Crusader stronghold on the Levantine coast, Acre, fell to the Mamluks. The war the Templars existed to fight was, in any practical sense, over. The order remained immensely wealthy, immensely privileged, and increasingly difficult to explain. To understand why the arrests happened, it helps to close a loop this portrait left open. Part 1 ended with Bishop Bernard Saisset under arrest and Pope Boniface VIII in Rome composing his answer to a king who had just demonstrated that no clerical immunity in France was beyond his reach. That answer came in 1302 in the bull Unam Sanctam, the most absolute assertion of papal supremacy ever issued. Philip's response was not diplomatic. In September 1303, Guillaume de Nogaret led an armed company to Boniface's residence at Anagni, where the aging pope was confronted and detained for several days before townspeople secured his release. He died within weeks, never fully recovered from the encounter. His successor reigned barely a year. The conclave that followed, fractured between factions, eventually settled in 1305 on Bertrand de Got, Archbishop of Bordeaux, a Gascon, not a Roman, and a man whose election owed a great deal to French influence. He took the name Clement V, he never set foot in Rome. By 1309, his court had settled in Avignon, within the political orbit of the French crown. The Pope Philip would need for what came next was, by the time he needed him, already in place. The case against the Templars had been under construction for some time before the arrests gave it form. Nogaret built it the way he built every case, methodically, with charges sequenced to produce maximum legal and public effect. Heresy, the denial of Christ and the trampling or spitting upon the cross during secret initiation rites, an obscene ritual kiss exchanged between initiate and superior, the encouragement of sodomy among the brethren, the worship in some confessions of an idol, a name that surfaces in the trial record as Baphomet, a term whose origin scholars still debate and whose appearance in the testimony is difficult to separate from the leading questions of the men who extracted it. Financial corruption and secrecy completed the indictment. There was one procedural obstacle. The Templars answered to the Pope alone, and Philip had not asked Clement's permission. He solved this the way his machine solved most obstacles, with a legal instrument already standing ready. Guillaume de Paris, the Dominican serving as Grand Inquisitor of France, was also, conveniently, Philip's own confessor. Acting through the Inquisitor's authority rather than the Crown's, Philip could claim ecclesiastical jurisdiction without ecclesiastical permission, a maneuver, not an authorization. Clement was, by every surviving account, furious when he learned what had happened. He had been outmaneuvered on his own ground in a matter touching an order under his direct protection. But the king who had broken one pope at Anagni did not need to break this one outright. He needed only to apply pressure until resistance became more costly than compliance. By the following month, Clement issued the bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, instructing every Christian monarch in Europe to arrest the Templars within their own realms and seize their assets in the Pope's name. The unilateral act had been given retroactive cover. The pattern from the Jewish expulsion and the Lombard extractions: identify the target, construct the argument, deploy the apparatus, absorb the proceeds, had now been applied to an institution that answered, in theory, to no earthly power but Rome's, and Rome, this time, had been brought inside the operation rather than left to oppose it. What followed the arrests was confession on a scale that requires explanation rather than simple acceptance. Molay confessed within days, admitting to the denial of Christ during his own initiation decades earlier. So did the great majority of the brothers interrogated in Paris that autumn, under methods of questioning that included, by documented record, torture. Confessions extracted under those conditions are not, by any standard a careful historian applies, equivalent to confessions freely given. And the geography of the trial across Europe makes the point with unusual clarity. In England, where the Crown was initially reluctant to authorize torture, the early hearings produced almost no admissions of guilt. In Aragon, Templar garrisons resisted arrest militarily and were besieged in their own castles rather than questioned in a chamber. In France, where the apparatus Philip had spent 20 years building was applied without restraint, confessions arrived swiftly and in volume. The pattern does not prove the charges false. It strongly suggests that wherever coercion was heaviest admission was most reliable, which is not the relationship between method and truth that a fair process produces. For years afterward, the case dragged through competing jurisdictions, diocesan trials of individual Templars, and a separate papal commission examining the order as an institution. In 1310, more than 500 Templars came forward in Paris prepared to defend the order against the charges, many having retracted their earlier confessions once removed from immediate duress. The defense collapsed within weeks. The Archbishop of Seine, brother to one of Philip's senior ministers, declared 54 of those men relapsed heretics for withdrawing confessions already given, and had them burned outside Paris that May. The remaining defenders fell silent. The message had been delivered with the same precision Philip applied to everything else. The Council of Vienne convened in October 1311 to settle the order's fate. The Pope did not formally convict the Templars of heresy as an institution. The evidence even gathered under these conditions had not produced the unambiguous result the Crown wanted. Instead, in March 1312, Clement dissolved the order administratively by papal provision, citing the scandal surrounding it rather than confirmed guilt. Its vast holdings were assigned in May to the Hospitallers, the order's rival and closest counterpart, though the French crown extracted substantial compensation for its costs before releasing French properties, and the transfer dragged on for years. What is not disputed is what disappeared in the process. The debts the crown owed to the temple, debts whose precise scale remains a subject of scholarly disagreement, ceased to exist the moment the creditor did. The institution that had managed the kingdom's treasury was gone. So was the obligation to repay it. Jacques de Molay spent nearly 7 years in royal custody after his arrest, his case unresolved even after Vienne. On the 18th of March, 1314, he was brought before a public scaffold erected outside Notre Dame alongside Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, to hear the sentence a papal commission had settled on, perpetual imprisonment. It should have ended there with 2 old men returned to their cells. It did not. Before the assembled crowd, Molay and Charnay retracted their confessions. They declared the order innocent of the charges that had destroyed it, and declared themselves guilty only of the lie they had told under duress to save their own lives. Philip, informed of the retraction, did not wait for further proceedings. By that evening, both men had been condemned as relapsed heretics and burned on the Île des Juifs, a small island in the Seine near the western tip of the Île de la Cité. Near contemporary chroniclers preserve a tradition that Molay, from the flames, summoned both Clement V and Philip IV to stand before God within the year, a tradition recorded close enough to the event to be more than later invention, but not in any source that can be called an eyewitness account, and one a careful historian holds at arm's length rather than asserts as fact. What is documented without dispute is the sequence that followed. Clement V died the following April. Philip IV collapsed during a hunting expedition near Fontainebleau that November and died within weeks, aged 46. The cause was never conclusively established by his physicians: a stroke, an apoplexy, a sudden internal collapse. He had built a machine capable of dismantling the wealthiest order in Christendom. He did not live a full year past the men he had used it to destroy. The dawn arrests of October 1307, the use of the Inquisitor of France as a jurisdictional instrument, Clement V's initial fury and subsequent capitulation, the burning of 54 Templars in 1310, the administrative dissolution at the Council of Vienne in 1312, and the executions of Molay and Charnay in 1314 are all documented in the surviving trial records and chronicle sources and are not seriously contested. Malcolm Barber's The Trial of the Templars remains the standard scholarly treatment in English and is the primary source consulted for this episode's sequence of events. What remains genuinely debated is the weight of financial motive against political and religious calculation in Philip's decision. The popular claim that the Templars were the single largest creditor of the French crown overstates a more precise reality. The order administered the royal treasury and held vast reserves of untaxed wealth, a different and in some ways more significant financial threat than simple debt. Philip's debt to the temple is documented. Its exact scale is not settled in the scholarship. The geographic pattern of confessions, abundant where torture was used, rare where it was not, is well established and is the primary evidence modern historians cite against the charge's reliability. The term Baphomet appears in trial testimony, but its origin and meaning are disputed, and it should not be treated as a confirmed element of any actual Templar practice. Clement V's portrayal as a pope wholly controlled by Philip is, in more recent scholarship, somewhat complicated. He resisted longer and more substantively than the popular caricature allows, even as the structural pressure on him was real and ultimately decisive. The curse attributed to Molay's final words appears in sources close enough to the event to predate later legend building, but cannot be verified as his actual statement. The destruction of the Knights Templar did not require Philip IV to prove his case. It required him to control the process by which guilt was determined, who was questioned, under what conditions, and what was done to those who changed their answers once the conditions changed. An order that had stood for nearly 2 centuries, that had safeguarded the treasuries of kings, ceased to exist not because the evidence against it was conclusive, but because the machine built to examine it had been constructed by the man with the most to gain from its verdict. That is not a medieval problem with a medieval solution. It is a question about what confession means when extracted under duress, and what justice means when the same hand holds the scale and the sword. Philip IV answered it once completely in a matter of years, and the discomfort of that answer has outlasted him. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.